this is not the first time you and me speak on stage.
It is not, and actually I should probably begin this with something of an apology. The last time we did this, I had just got back from traveling, and I was jet-lagged to the point of madness. It's exactly the same today. This actually feels like a dream for me. In fact, it could be a dream, very pleasant dream, obviously sitting here with you.
Yeah.
But the simple fact is I've been in America for the past week explaining to Americans the difference between Switzerland and Sweden. So all for a good cause, for a good cause.
I mean, you travel all the time, but maybe some of us here know, I know very well who you are. Could you briefly tell us who exactly you are?
Well, I suppose I have a right to sit here today because my company, for the past 6 years, we have been bringing Scandinavian startups, primarily Swedish, increasingly Norwegian, rarely Danish, to the UK, using the British media's obsession with all things Scandinavian as a way to localize them, to help them scale up into the English-speaking world. Because we did invent the language that the world speaks.
Yeah. Are you sure?
I'm certain of it. And also, I should just add, Brexit is not going to make any difference at all unless the entire world decides to speak French in protest at our stupidity. England will retain a significant place in the world because of the language.
Yeah, I mean, it is the favorite language, I guess. Swedish people speak very well after a few beers.
Well, Swedish people as a rule tend to speak better English than the English.
Yeah, that's true. I agree.
Yeah.
Okay, so Benjamin, I'm a big fan of yours in PR, in public relations. I mean, do we even say that word? And what does that really mean? I mean, these are companies who want to PR.
Of course.
Let's define it first.
Well, defining it, I suppose you could say, obviously PR stands for public relations, but in many respects that's actually something of a misnomer, because what you're actually doing is you're talking to the media, who in turn convey to the public your message. So in a sense, whereas marketing and advertising is obviously far more direct, because you're actually speaking directly to the consumers, what makes PR special when it works, which, to be honest...
When it works.
Okay. What makes it special is the fact that you're actually communicating with media whose opinions and whose method of transmission, I would always argue, is infinitely more targeted and effective.
Does it come more like authoritarian, like in the influence is bigger than, let's say if I do a campaign versus if I have PR media strategy, or PR... like set of articles, okay, and campaign. So does the impact comes more with authority or more with credibility?
Well, look, I think it does carry credibility because obviously with an advert or with a marketing campaign, you are buying the space and you're guaranteed the space and you're filling it. Through media relations or PR, you are actually talking to journalists who are, as a rule, very intelligent people whose opinions are respected. And as a result, I would argue the impact and the credibility factor is far greater. But, as I say, 99% of PR does absolutely nothing whatsoever. And actually, a significant proportion of you, if you're thinking about PR, I would probably be the first to advise you, don't do it.
You work with it.
Well,
you're saying to people, don't come to me?
No. I'm not saying don't come to me. I'm saying do come to. It's almost subliminal, you know. This message. But I think one of the challenges with PR is it's very hard to evaluate.
Okay.
Obviously, with an advertising campaign, you are slinging several $1 million at something, and you can then see an uptick in terms of engagement. The problem with PR is that PR for startups tends to be propagated upon what is fundamentally a lie, which is PR will deliver you downloads and installs and user acquisition. Whereas the simple truth is most PR doesn't do that. If you think about, and as a rule, this is a pretty good one, why we go and see a movie. We go to see a movie because we've seen the trailer, marketing. We've seen an advert on the side of a bus. We've seen an interview with the star of the film. We've then had a friend recommend it to us. Now, certainly 2 out of 4 of those are not PR. So therefore, one of the fundamental mistakes that PR agencies make, and they deserve to be fired when they do this, is they promise the client, we will get you 1 million downloads in month 1. which they can't deliver.
Okay, so what should startups or scale-ups in this case have to think about deliverables when it comes to what do they get if they do it?
Well, I think the deliverables, if PR is done well and in a clever and news-based way, what it can do, and this was my exercise in coming to Sweden, was when I first came here 6 years ago, I was working on, at the time, my agency was all about arts, photography, music, a lot of very intellectual projects which never paid, with a bunch of extreme egomaniacs. And I'm not saying the Swedish project was one of these, but I was working with a Swedish photographer. And I came into contact with a whole load of startups in Stockholm at the time when that generation just after Spotify were kind of coming into their own. And a lot of them were going straight to America and disappearing without a trace. And I would see startup after startup, even during the months that I was there, were going to America and they were back within 3 months, their business having been stolen or destroyed because I adore Americans. I'm not being rude about Americans, but I think sometimes Swedes in America can be slightly naive about how Americans operate. Stockholm is a wonderful place to work because you are transparent, you're honest, you pay your bills on time, you're thoroughly collaborative people. Whereas obviously in America it can be slightly different in terms of how people posture. But the thing is, when I was meeting all of these startups in Stockholm, I realized they should come to Britain because, and maybe we'll talk about this, because the British are obsessed with the Swedes and we do actually adore you. And we also do know the difference between, as I've said, Switzerland, Swaziland, Seychelles, Sweden. We actually can differentiate. But also, what you can offer a startup through good PR is, number one, exposure to the investment community. And nothing makes you more attractive to an investor than an article in a credible place raising the profile of an individual within your company who is interesting, or indeed explaining the potential application of your startup longer term. This is very seductive for investors and very useful. The second thing is, a lot of startups have very quirky, weird names, which sometimes, and I'm sure there's not a single person in this room who conforms to this, but they sometimes sound a bit like sexually transmitted diseases. and the thing is, the startup people know exactly what their startup does because they live, breathe, eat, drink it. They know it. But they kind of forget to explain it to everyone. So you have your quirky startup name, but it's unintelligible. So in other words, editorial media can actually explain and contextualize what your startup does, which is also very valuable. It's useful for recruitment. It's useful for connecting you with strategic and commercial partners, getting those meetings in place. Because if you wave an article in Bloomberg or Forbes or Wired in front of a business that you're desperate to have a meeting with, well, self-evidently, they're going to meet with you, far more so than if you're just an invisible startup full of nice people from Uppsala or indeed Stockholm. And then finally, PR can deliver users, but not in its traditional way, which is, I don't want to dwell on bad PR.
But you had a lot of things that I want to follow up. You said when PR works. So there's this thing that says a good PR or a bad PR is still PR. Is that real or it's not? Like if someone does something bad and then every media picks it up, is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, back in the day when I used to look after arts clients, I did some work for Kevin Spacey, and I would ask him the question: is all PR good PR or not? I mean, the simple fact is that one can become over preoccupied with the power of editorial media, the power of social media, and sometimes forget the fact that actually the majority of people perhaps aren't that interested or aren't that bothered. Bad PR, when something goes really wrong, it can be disastrous because you lose your commercial partners, you lose people who who are effectively supporting you or acting as the go-between to the public. So in fact, there is such a thing as bad PR. But what I'm saying is most things that people think about PR probably in the long term are not.
Okay.
But
so when do they start to think about PR then? Like startups, we are cheap people. We don't have money. We are always limited with resources. when do we start planning for our PR strategies? If it's going to get investment, recruitment, customers.
Okay. Look at it this way. If you are looking for investment, if you are looking for recruits to recruit people, if you are looking to attract these partners, then you should think about it. But I mean, this also does lead into the thing about Britain and Britain's role in this. Even though I'm being glib about Brexit, happy days, the fact remains that what I discovered, and I kind of dressed this up as being part of some incredible grand plan I had. It really wasn't. It was a series of amazing coincidences. But what I discovered when I was first in Stockholm, watching these Swedes going straight to America, because everybody still wants to go to America, I mean, and they
It's
should.
a big market,
And indeed, for the next 20 years at least. But the thing I realized was the British, during the recession, we're about to have another one, I'm sure, but during the last recession, we became culturally and socially obsessed with Sweden. And it's really interesting. We'd always been in love with the Swedes in some level or other, but we started importing all of your depressing TV shows and reading your depressing books about people being murdered in Skåne and this sort of stuff. and suddenly, the British middle classes, despairing at the collapse of our country, suddenly started dressing their children in Danish clothes and sending them to a school which had a Swedish education policy. And suddenly, brand Scandinavia, and in particular brand Sweden, was incredibly attractive. So the thing is, I realized that, hang on, if you have a startup, and I look after a lot of very cool Swedish startups like LifeSum and Fishbrain and Mentimeter. These are all much loved clients of mine, Hyper Island as well. Each of these you can attach to a preconceived stereotype and favorable notion that the British hold. Oh, the Swedes are so healthy, the highest gym membership of any country in the world. Of course they would have an app like LifeSum. Oh, the Swedes, they're also collaborative and eager to talk, and they have this weird Jantelagen thing. Of course, that makes sense for Mentimeter. So my point is there is a media narrative in coming to Britain, and also the fact that 3 of the 10 biggest news sites on the planet, including number 1, number 3, and number 7.
Which are?
Well, number 1 is Mail Online,
Yes.
which is pushing the definition of news, I will admit. Number 3 is The Guardian. Number 7 is BBC News Online.
Yeah.
So in other words, you've got 3 huge platforms that are British in origin. And so therefore, coming to a country that already loves you for being Swedish, as an entry point, you can then cash that in when you go to other territories.
Cash that in, I like that.
Well, there we are, upselling in Uppsala. And I also apologize, because that's jet lag. I actually just answered a question she didn't ask
It's okay.
ask me.
I was going to ask you. So first Swedish startups are like already a brand when they come, and they take the English.
The Swedishness means that they can get through the door ahead of
first,
everybody else.
so the first pit stop is UK.
That
you
would be
gain
my
that
argument.
market, and then you go to.
Well, also don't forget the fact that a lot of people think you actually have. Most of my clients don't have a physical presence in the UK. They don't have an office.
No.
Most of my clients have a limited physical presence in the US. And the simple fact is, don't lose sight of the fact that on your own doorstep are international correspondents in Stockholm, in the Nordics, who write for the international media, whether it's US, Canadian, Australian, wherever. So you should talk to them. But just remember, when you actually go to America, there are going to be a whole load of other people called Lindbergh, whose grandparents are from Minnesota, and there's nothing particularly special about being Swedish. Though that is changing in certain parts of America. Brand Sweden is on the rise.
Yeah, especially in the valley. Okay, so let me go back to my question. So if you have...
which this time I'll answer.
Yeah, so if there's one person here who has a scale-up or a startup, and then they want to get on BBC Online, for instance, do they go and call BBC and say, put me there, I'll pay you 5,000 crowns?
Well, yes, I think in maybe parts of Italy that's how it works. You leave a large. Actually, my former father-in-law once did explain to me, former emphasis on that, how you actually should in Italy you leave a suitcase on the table and then you go to the bathroom and come back and the suitcase is gone, and this is how to do it. But no, in effect, what it is that journalists want case studies. and they want people who are relevant to stories. So if you see, and this actually does go back to your question about when should people think about doing PR, every single time you see a story on something that is relevant to your company, and you feel slightly pissed off, thinking, well, hang on, why aren't they talking to me? My company can provide data, we can provide insights, we can provide context. Pick up the phone. Why not?
It won't work.
No.
It works.
No.
It
It can work. I mean, obviously come to me instead, because I've got 19 people in my office who will really focus on it. But the principle stands. Founders, media journalists want to speak to people who will contribute to the development of a story that they're writing.
So it feels like if I am a startup or scale up, it's like not spending money, but more like investing my money into PR if I come to you.
I'm not going to contradict you on that.
No,
Not at all.
but I mean, I work in marketing and comms. I know the value of PR. It's good credibility for it.
And this is what it all comes down to.
Yeah, okay. And you have found the magic formula of promoting Nordic startups? Is there like, I pick this module and then you package it?
I think the most lovely thing about working with Swedes is the fact that they are prepared to be creative. If you were working for Coca-Cola and a story emerges, it's going to take Coca-Cola 7 weeks to sign off a very bland comment, which is of no interest to anyone, which you can then give to the journalist. A Swedish startup, you can speak to the founder within 5 minutes and say, look, the BBC wants someone at 1 o'clock. Would you be prepared to give them 600 words on this? Or would you be prepared to go on CNN? I think the formula, it's not all the fact that you're Scandinavian, and that's wonderful, though that is useful, because it feeds into a narrative.
Yes.
There is an established media narrative in Britain, which is Skype, Spotify, scaling up internationally, and various other sub-narratives, for want of a better expression. Just as much as for Norway, there is a narrative of what are they all going to do after oil. So there's a solid narrative you're feeding into. But for me, I think the trick is it's all about news. It's all about finding some way to either respond to the news or find a way to set the news agenda in a way which brings to life what it is that you do. And I think this is pivotal. The simple fact is, think about the theme of your startup scale-up, and then work out, is there an external organization that we can link with to bring to life what we do and also take advantage of their user base?
We have 6 minutes, I think.
6 minutes,
okay, wait.
yes, right.
So if we would like, if let's say you would give 3 pieces of advice for scale up that tonight, scale ups work hard.
Right.
So if tonight after this event they want to go home and do it, what would those be in terms of their PR? Let's say before they come and contact you.
Okay. Well, I mean, first off, I think the news aspect is key. Think in your head, what are 3 or 4 big news stories that relate to my company? And this can be directly, or it can be completely tangentially. There's a story about migration, for example, and you have an incredibly talented co-founder or staff member who is a migrant and wants to tell their story of success and how. I mean, that's a very tangential angle. So think about news stories that you should have been a part of. Look ahead at events that you know within the broader calendar are going to be significant. Don't show up at an event and start trying to meet with journalists. That is a fool's errand.
Don't do.
Well, I mean, just because there normally aren't that many journalists there, and also they're very busy.
So should you like find the journalist, like you shortlist the journalist?
You could, but I mean, I think what I've always found is the smartest thing if you're going to an event is you make an announcement 2 days before the event. You announce a big piece of news, and as part of that news, you reference that in advance of this week's X event in Uppsala, or wherever it might be, this big news story is being rolled out. Now, the event in Uppsala, or wherever it might be, will then start tweeting and messaging that news story in which you have name-checked them to everyone on the ground, which means that by the time you show up, everyone wants to meet with you. So, I mean, that's one thing. So, I mean, I think for starters, think about news. Think about an external organization, academic, charitable, or a totally different company, that you can see that partnering with will lead to something wonderful happening. So to give you the quickest of examples, Fishbrain, I hope you know what this is. It's an app for anglers, no less. When they passed 1 million users in America, the traditional PR model would have been, let's send out a press release saying we passed 1 million users in America, which of course is of no interest to anyone. So what we did instead was we looked at a big US government agency called the US Fish and Wildlife Service, whose job it is to look after fish and wildlife, and we realized they didn't have an app. In fact, they had 200 people whose jobs were to go around America looking for endangered lizards and newts and birds and God knows what else. So we went to them and said, look, we've got 1 million users of this Swedish app who are active in America. Why don't you use them to crowdsource information for you? Unbelievably, this US government agency said yes. So not only do we have a cute story about the partnership between this upstart app, as it were, but also suddenly the US Fish and Wildlife Service, which is made up of followers and members and fans, Americans who shoot things and fish for things, they suddenly started shouting about it to their user base. So this suddenly made, the whole thing's a virtuous cycle. And I think the third thing is work out who within your organization has interesting stories and would be good to talk
The
to
people
media.
in the organization.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, absolutely.
Okay, let me see if anyone has a question before I continue. 3 more minutes, okay. It's like I have to push the audience for questions. I can ask you more questions. No questions after hearing all this?
There we are.
Is anyone have a scale up? Yes? Do you think that this PR strategy will help you? Yeah, you see?
We can have an informal conversation before well, we could. What does your scale up do? What does it do? What's your
for a cloud solution for archive purpose. So we help people storage their data and files.
Okay.
And do it in a cloud solution manner.
Very interesting.
Could that be something for England?
Could that be something for England? Yes. Storage is, post Brexit, which is uppermost in my mind. The changing regulations may mean that there is an opportunity in that respect. But I mean, that's interesting. What kind of companies would use your service?
Well, at this moment, it's bank and insurance industry foremost, but also healthcare and so on.
Well, you know, it's interesting because very often, and I think this is a meandering and relevant point to make, the wonderful thing about a small company, whether startup or scale up, is that you are more nimble and more agile very often than the partners that use your services. You know, it's the same principle as the amount of large companies that will just absorb or white label startups. The same principle applies if a company is using you. Very often, they won't be able to put out news or information, but using you as a conduit for it might be strategically useful for them. So, I mean, never rule out the fact that actually you, all of you collectively, make big, old companies look very cool. And I think as long as you don't let them walk all over you, and you actually have a collaborative news angle to explore, then it can make sense.
You see? Now you have someone to have fika with after this, or have a drink
There
with.
we are. There we are.
Okay, maybe I can have. Okay, I should cut it. Okay.
Yeah, this was a dream, and
Okay.
what a wonderful one it was.
I think you gave a lot of good tips
Yeah.
with the PR strategy. And if people want to connect with you, how do they find you? Just said that this is a good way to end.
Well, that's a good way to end. I mean, LinkedIn's always good.
LinkedIn is
You
okay.
can become one of my 10,000 friends called Johan or Linnea on Facebook if you wish. But LinkedIn's always a pretty good route.
Okay. Thank you, Benjamin. It's
No,
always
thank
fun
you.
to chat with you.
Thank you.